Okay, going live. I think we're ready to get started here where we left off. That's going to be, we're working on some forms. We want to open up terminal here and get that going. Right. Hopefully that's big enough to read. npm run dev. Cool. Let's go to localhost 3000 in our browser. That should open up our index.html file with our form set up. What have we got so far is we have a form with some inputs. Some of them are required. Looks like we got a field set. We've got some JavaScript loading. And when we run that JavaScript, I think what I'm going to do, yeah, no, that's fine. When we run that JavaScript, we've got a function that submits forms with fetch, basically pulls all of the data off of the HTML form and does all the things that it needs to do, sends search parameters in the URL search if it's a GET request. Otherwise, it sends the data in the body of the request. Cool. And where we were is for each form on our page, we are turning off the default validation so that we can validate with JavaScript. And on the submit event, we are running some validation logic. And if it's an invalid form, then we stop early. And if it is valid, then we use JavaScript to submit the form. Cool. So the next thing that I want to do, if we try this, we're getting some validation messages. Basically what I want to do is connect these messages to these inputs. So how am I going to do that? Well, the first thing we said was that we can validate the input the default way. The way HTML handles it is it waits until I submit the form, and then it goes back to the first input and will highlight it and will tell me the value is missing. What I actually want to do is trigger a validation event when the user leaves the input. So on blur is what I want to do. And what we're going to do is go back to our code. And we're going to say input tags. Got the form submission function. That's fine. We'll do that up here. So input of document query selector all. Cool. Just going to get all of the inputs on the page and loop over them. And then we're going to say, what do I want to say is input.add event listener. That's not what I want. I want to add something to the blur event. Right. And on the blur event, I basically want to get the event.target. And that's going to give me input, theoretically. So let's go back here. We reload the page. Okay, on each blur, we get the event target, which is the input. However, yeah, no, that should work. I'm trying to think if we have any sort of bubbling, but that should work. And then we can say, cool. We can validate the input. So the first thing I want to do is, well, we've got a little bit of that logic here, right? Right. So I'm going to pull this logic because this should actually exist in my blur event. Cool. So now we just check if the form is invalid. We get to that first input and focus on it. And hopefully by the time the user has tabbed through our form, they will have triggered our blur event, which will trigger our validation, which will then show our errors. So here's where we are. We don't need that. We don't need that. We just need this guy, which is going to be no. Yeah, we can do that. Input equals event target. That's event target. I want that to be a type of HTML input element. And then we can get rid of that. Get rid of that. Actually, I think we still need that. What am I missing here? There we go. Okay, so on blur, we run through our previous logic here. And we could clean this up. I'm going to leave it like this. This is fine for now. So let's see, reload. Yep, now we're validating each one. When it blurs, when we submit, we're not submitting because we have an invalid thing. So it goes to the first element, it goes to the first invalid input and highlights it. Now, what I need to do is essentially create a new div on demand and put these errors into it. So let's do that. We've got our errors. Got the validity state. And we can say, yeah, we'll do that down here. Const errors container equals document dot create element. We're going to create a div. And then on that div, we basically need an ID because we are going to, well, we'll get to that later, I suppose. We're going to say classless add errors. Sure. And then Do I want to do this every time it blurs? Probably not. I probably only want to do this when the input is invalid. Okay. And then I'm going to, instead of console log those errors, I'm going to say errors container dot inner text equals errors dot join. I'm going to separate the errors with a space, or I guess in our case with no, I'm going to separate my errors with a space, and each of these error messages is going to end with a period. Cool. So now we have our errors set up, and then I want to append my errors to the DOM after the input. Input. Parent node. No. Input dot append. No, after. Input dot after errors container. Cool. Let's try that. Right, because we only have the error container if it exists. Value is required. Cool, cool, cool. Okay. This is looking much better. Now, something that let's look at this this user experience. And oh, we got someone in the chat. What is up, Web Dev Journey? What's up with me? Not much. Building out some forms, you know. Having fun. Oh, I need to check on my thing. Am I actually streaming? I guess I am. Is my camera working? Feels like it's not. Am I actually streaming? I guess I am. Is my camera working? There's an echo. Okay, well, looks good. Good to see you. Glad you're here. Is this being restreamed on YouTube? Yes, it is. So if you want to go on YouTube now or you want to go later, it's going to be recorded and just be there if you want. There's also 2 other sections that I let me know if that's something you're into. Ha! Sorry about that. I turned myself off, meaning to turn my video off. I guess I turned the audio off. Yeah, so to answer your question, is this being restreamed on YouTube? Yes, there is. Yes, this is going to be restreamed on YouTube. It's recorded there as well if you want to check it out. There's 2 other videos leading up to this point. So you're welcome to check those out. I don't have a Git repo set up yet, but we will be doing that shortly. And I don't know what's going on with my camera. It looks like it's frozen. So let's see if we can switch that. I guess we're switching cameras. Looks like it works. I don't know. Camera seems to be having an issue. Am I currently studying this material and practicing live? You could say that. I am. I've been doing web development for like 9 years or so. So I did about a year of deep diving into forms and creating forms for the web in a way that's like accessible, performant, things like that, but also better user experience. And what I've come to is I like building forms that work in HTML and then using a little bit of JavaScript to make the user experience a little bit better. So what we're working on today, for example, is rebuilding the form so that when JavaScript loads on the page, it disables the default form validation stuff. So let's look at disabling JavaScript. Oh, you've just been working on a form yourself as part of your study. That's awesome. Glad to have you here. So you're totally into this right now. Well, I'm totally into you being totally into this. If I want to take a look, yeah. Send me a link. We can take a look. We can look at it on the show. But to give you an idea, let's look at what HTML gives us out of the box. So if we look at the form that I have here, we have the form with the action and the method. So I'm basically saying that this form, I want to submit the data to this /API endpoint. And I'm using the post method because I want to send that as like private data in the form, the request body. I don't want to send that as query parameters. So I see you just sent me the link. I'm going to make sure that this is safe to share before we share it publicly. Okay, it looks like we've got business card web app. Let's pull that up. Okay. And it looks like I've got my name, profession. Okay, so I can like edit, right? Okay, cool. So I can edit my name, profession. I can hit save. I can say my name is Austin. That's fine. That's fine. Contact details. Kind of makes me wonder if that's real contact information. So what's going on with these guys? Okay. Oh, okay. I got my background that I can change here. Okay. And then this must be the text on top. Okay. Let's go with something a little darker. Actually, let's go with like a purple. That's what I like. Let's save that. Cool. Very well done. If you don't, what's this? I can delete the card, of course. Cancel. This is looking pretty good. I can download this as an image. What's this do? Okay, I can save that as an SVG. Right on. So if I inspect that, sorry, now I'm just like curious. Looks like, okay, cool. You're saving this image as a data URI. That's pretty rad, which means I can actually go ahead and open that in a new tab. And sure enough, there it is. That's cool. Let's get a little bit nitpicky here and see what this is looking like. Cool. You're using a button. That's awesome. Very good for accessibility because it means I can tab to it. A couple things that, assuming that you don't mind me kind of looking into this a bit more, you can tell me if you don't want me to continue. But yeah, it looks like you have a title on the delete button to discard. Discard, not discard. That's cool. I think titles work pretty well for accessibility. You can probably do a little bit better for some less commonly used assistive technology by doing something like this. Let's see, edit as HTML. We can put something in here that says like discard, right? And then that's going to actually append it to the page, which we don't want. Actually, what I would probably want to do is throw that inside of a span with a class equals visually hidden. Close that. Close that. That's what I would do. And then on this visually hidden class, I would add Let's see, I'm going to pull it up from here. Where's my styles? Over here. There you go. Visually hidden. Just going to get all these rules. If you Google this, you can find it. Just search visually hidden class and it'll come up. But let's go ahead and get in our dev tools. I don't know if you can see that, so I'm going to bump up the size a bit. And then pull that up. We'll add a new rule for, oh, I'm on the wrong element. We'll add a new rule for visually hidden. And we will paste in all of our styles. And there you go. Now you don't see the text in there, which is great. So as far as HTML is concerned and assistive technology, this is a button with the contents of discard, which I think is helpful for more assistive technology that doesn't depend on the title. And we can look. Okay, so I'm making a custom made title on hover. No, I'm not making a custom made title on hover. I'm actually making a visually hidden title, which to visual users, they're not going to see it. But for assistive technology, they'll get to see it. So now if we look at the actual accessibility tree of this button, we can see that it says discard. And if I take off the title attribute, well, actually, sorry, that's the opposite of what I want to do. I want to leave the title attribute, and then I want to delete that span, and we can see. So yeah, for some accessibility elements, this is going to be good enough for some users. Other things, I know that if you wanted to support like voice control, which is, I've never used it, but might as well do it. That visually hidden CSS is really common for accessibility stuff. Still, one thing I do like about having the title here that you did is it gives that little added feature that when I hover over it, I do see as a visual user, I can see that there's more context in case I didn't know what this button does. So well done. Do you do that on everything? It doesn't look like this one has it. So yeah, you do have an export button, alt text. That's great. That might be something that you could put a title on, because as it is right now, I personally don't know what it does. But yeah, you still need to finish the pass on accessibility. I think you're doing a great job so far. So a lot better than most. And if I want to do my own thing here, cool. I can add my own. I can save that, and bam, there I am, looking good. I love that you add this default image when I don't add one. That's pretty cool. So yeah, this is rad. Just something you're messing around with. Well, I think it's really cool. Keep messing around. You're on the right path. All right, cool. So I'm going to get back into what I've been working on. But feel free to keep sending messages and stuff. I'll be chatting distractedly, but chatting. So where were we? We are on our page. We disabled JavaScript on this page. So there's a lot of reasons why we want to be cognizant of building applications in the event that JavaScript fails. And it's not only that a user might have JavaScript turned off. It could be that a user is on a spotty connection and they were able to, during like a good connection phase, they were able to download the HTML and CSS, but then the spotty connection failed to download the JavaScript. So the app, as far as the user is concerned, loaded, but the JavaScript did not. Another scenario might be a user has ad blocker turned on and something in the ad blocker got in the way of your JavaScript loading. I actually have an anecdote for this. I was trying to sign up for a service or a website, and I kept on hitting the like create account link, and it was not working. So I couldn't sign up. And the reason was because I do have an ad blocker, or I think I was even maybe just using Brave or something like that, and it blocked the error and exception tracker. So there's some tools like what's it called? Sentry JS. And error and exception tracking, stuff like that. So what Sentry JS is you can install the script on your page and it'll run. And then anytime your page has an exception, like JavaScript throws an error or whatever, or user finds a bug, Sentry can capture that session, give some information about the user session, not personally identifiable information, but things about like what browser they're using, I don't know, other stuff. And then also information about the error itself. So if it's a type error or a network error or something like that. So that's super useful. However, this application that I was trying to sign up for, they were running their application within Sentry's or in a way that was dependent on Sentry's code. So because my ad blocking was preventing Sentry's script from running, it was also preventing their runtime JavaScript from running. And as a result, I had JavaScript technically enabled for first-party scripts, but I wasn't allowing Sentry to load, which prevented them from loading, yada, yada, yada. JavaScript was not working. I couldn't use their application because they didn't build it in a way that if JavaScript does not load, it still works. So let's look at our form again. We are submitting some stuff or trying to submit some stuff to an API endpoint, and we're using HTML to do that by default. The default behavior is when I click submit form, the browser, in this case Brave or Chrome, is going to check the inputs, see if any of them are have a validation issue. In this case, our first input is required. So notice that the focus state goes to that first input. I actually get my little cursor in there, and it tells me an error message. What my error is. If we go back to enabling JavaScript and we reload, now our JavaScript is loading. We're recreating that. When we submit the form, one thing that our JavaScript is doing is appending this no validate HTML attribute onto our form. That's going to prevent the default validation from running. And because we're no longer depending on the default validation, we still have to do some work like preventing the form from submitting, going to the first invalid input, focusing on it so that we get that focus state. But then we also want to show those error messages. And where I'm at right now in this journey is I'm actually, how did I toggle JavaScript on and off with the palette? In Chrome, I actually don't know how to open this up without keyboard bindings, but I'm using Windows, so it's Control-Shift-P. Oops, in the wrong place. Control-Shift-P opens up my command palette, and then I can just do a search for, well, I guess not JavaScript, but I can do a search for disable, and I can see that disable JavaScript is on there. And once it's disabled, I can do the same thing and search for enable. And when JavaScript is disabled, that's going to be an option on here. And question, do I use the palette for other things? Yes, I do. One of my favorite things to use the palette for in Chrome-based browsers is something that Firefox does much better on its own. So if I right-click anywhere on here, I get some options of what I can do based on, what browser extensions I have installed and whatever. I can inspect an element and find that exact element, and then I can go through the DOM and find highlight which one of the elements I want to focus on. So in this case, let's say I want to focus on my form. Once I have a form or a DOM node selected, I can go into my palette and I can do screenshot. And this gives me a bunch of options, which in Firefox are available just in the right-click menu. But in Chrome, you have to use this command palette. And I can say capture area screenshot, which I guess is going to let me select an area. I can capture the full size, which is the whole page. I can capture a screenshot, which I'm not sure what that does on its own, or I can capture the node. So the node is the one that I like to use because that lets me select in the DOM which DOM node I want to screenshot. And it's pretty cool. One thing I wish the command palette would do is remember my recent commands. So if those were like right up here at the top, so I wouldn't have to always search for screenshot. But yeah, just capture screenshot. What's that going to do? Okay, it's going to pull up. I don't know what it captured, but right on. And yeah, use that with right click. Yeah, right click in Chrome. You can't capture a screenshot by default. If you have a browser extension, some of them will add it. But yeah, otherwise Firefox does it. Oh, okay, DOM node. To capture node screenshot. Cool. Well, thank you for that. Never read all of that whole list. Okay, cool. So let's get back into this. What am I trying to do? Oh yeah. So there is an error here. And one error that I have is we're appending the errors to the DOM, but as I keep blurring and unblurring, those get re-added to the DOM. And the reason is that we are adding them, but we are never removing them. So let's just look at my notes over here. Oh, right. Okay, so what I want to do is when we have an input that is showing the error message, one thing that we want to be cognizant of is the accessibility concerns. So with the default behavior, when we click submit and it was showing that little default pop-up, that would actually be read to the user that there's like that error going on with the input. So we want to create that same sort of connection between our input and our error messages here. Never mind that we're printing a million of them. So the way we need to do that is with Aria Attributes. So Aria is something that you kind of want to treat like, I don't know, hot sauce. Like that, it's a bad analogy, but a little bit is good, but too much can be really bad. Bad analogy, but we're going to go with it. Right. So the way we do Aria Attributes is we would basically need to create an ID on our container here. So we have this error container and we need to give the error container an ID dot ID. Oops, I have my caps lock on. ID equals something, right? And because we're using JavaScript to programmatically go and find every input on this page and append this error container to the DOM, we don't necessarily want to generate that randomly. I mean, I guess we could use a random string generator and just like throw it out there. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to call that something, and then we'll say it's like errors. Cool. So what is this something? What the something is going to be is the ID of the input. So I don't know about you, but I don't really like adding, or I guess the inputs already have IDs, because that's a sort of best practice is for this reason is these Aria attributes kind of depend on IDs. So we put an ID on all of our inputs. So we have that available as we are looping over each input, right? So I'm actually going to pull that out. I'm going to say that the input ID equals the, sorry, I have that in the wrong place. There we go. Input ID equals the input.id. Again, because I like to write these things in the event that someone else is going to be using them, it's likely that some user may not include this ID. So what we're going to do is if the ID does not exist, we actually are going to generate a random ID. So we're going to do math.random to string 36. And then the slice 2 to 9, that's probably taken from some or substring. That's probably taken from some GitHub repo, but I just want slice 2. So I'm going to take all the characters after the index of 2. So we can see what that looks like. Yeah, it looks like you're asking if I'm creating some sort of template literal where I'm creating the input. Yeah, eventually we're going to be doing that once we have the input ID to work with. So we want the input ID because we're going to be using that in a few places. So what was I doing just now? I wanted to show what this little snippet does. It basically just generates a random number or two string of base 36, I believe. I don't know if I could explain off the top of my head how that works. But yeah, essentially it creates a number of 0 point something that's generated to some hashed is not the right word, but like string including numbers and characters. And because we want to get a random ID, we want to grab everything after the 0 point. So we use slice 2, takes off the first 2 characters, and we grab the rest. So again, looking back here, we're essentially going to say this input ID, this input ID right here is going to be taken from the input's ID if it exists, and if not, we're going to randomly generate it. Okay, and then because that input ID may not exist, we're going to say input ID equals input ID, just in case we need to fall back to our randomly generated one. We want to insert that into the DOM as well. And then we're going to say that our errors is going to be, I'm going to need to reference this in other places. Well, let's just do this. Our errors is going to be template string literal with our input ID, and then I'm actually just going to do dash errors because it's an ID. Cool. So now our input has an ID, our errors container has an ID, and now all we need to do is connect the two. So how do we do that? Let's see. We are going to say that input input dot set attribute of Aria described by, and it shouldn't be the input ID. It should actually be the error ID, which we have down here, described by. Okay, so we need to capture that as a variable anyway. So let's move that back up here. Let's move this into errors ID, and then we're going to say errors ID equals that. Okay, cool. So let's look at the existing behavior, and we can see that our input is here with an ID, a name, and it's required. If I click submit, that's going to get focused. Cool. I'm going to tab away, and then that's going to inject this div with a class of errors. That's what we currently have, not what we just wrote. And as far as this input is concerned, it has no idea what this DOM node means or whatever. And then if we reload with our changes in place, we can blur out of that, and we can see now that our errors container has an ID of name errors based on the ID of the input. And the input has an Aria described by of name errors, so it's connected. If we go down to our emails issue, it's also going to have the email errors and the described by email errors. So that's looking pretty good. Now that's working well from an accessibility perspective, but functionally we still have this like blur issue. So let's look back at what we got over here in the chat. Okay, saying that it's a cool method. Yeah, I think so. I think it works. It's kind of using JavaScript to, well, JavaScript is funny because a lot of the times we end up using JavaScript to break things that are already existing in just HTML. So some of the work that we need to do is take the HTML features we don't like, such as when you submit a form, it sort of refreshes the page and is not such a nice user experience. We can disable that with JavaScript, but then we've also disabled all of this validation stuff, which now we have to put back in. So let's see. Would love to hear a little about Aria and Aria labels whenever I have a break. I am not going to have a break long enough to talk about Aria and Aria labels. I think Aria is something that is worth looking into as you need it. And I'd say try to master things one at a time. When you learn something, don't try to implement it right away because it's very easy to get Aria wrong. And then that can actually create a worse experience for people. So only use it when you know absolutely what you're doing. Okay, cool. So now we have our errors coming in, and we want to remove the error element if there are no errors, right? So let's see. If the input is not valid, then we're going to push our errors. And if it is valid, let's see. What do I want to do? I think I guess I could do that in an else and just say I could say, so let's see, on blur, I create the input element, and otherwise, no. Only if the input is invalid am I creating this element. So the first time we do a check, if it's invalid, we create it. The second time we do a check, that element may or may not exist. So we want to do document dot get element by ID, errors ID, and then remove it. So that way, if we are in a valid state, I'm actually going to switch these up. We're going to go, if it's valid, we'll remove it. Otherwise, we'll run our validation stuff. Cool. And this will run if it doesn't find, like if that element, if there are no errors on the page, it doesn't matter because it's not going to find it. So it's not going to remove it. So that should be good. Now we can reload. And now if we get that first error, cool. If we go back and we get our second error, we are not removing it correctly. And that's because it's still invalid, which means this doesn't run, right? So let's undo that. And let's go back. And I think what we're going to want to do is just remove it every time. Oops. No, pull that back over here. Okay. Looking back at my notes. Yeah, it looks like that's what we're doing. Okay, so there's something else that we probably want to add, which is some validation with the Aria attributes. So let's just make sure that was working. Oh, no. Did I have some code logic? Did I mess up my code in here? If it's not valid, did I not reload the page? Okay, I'm not appending it to the page for some reason. If it's invalid, we create it, and then we place it after the input. All right, I'm missing something. Place, I totally wrote that wrong, but that's all right. So let's see, console cannot read properties of null, reading remove. Okay, I was wrong. That's my assumption, is get element by ID, and if that element exists, then we're going to remove it. Cool. There we go. That's working as expected. And we can see that our errors are not being repeated. And if I type something into my email one and satisfy the required field, but not the type field, we're getting our other error message. So that's great. Value is not the expected type of email. That's a terrible message, but you get the idea. Okay, I think that's working. Let's do one more thing, which is going back to some of these Aria attributes, is I want to say, by default, we'll just assume that the input is valid until we get to this point. So there's one more hint I want to give to assistive technology users, which is input.set attribute of Aria invalid. Well, that's pretty handy, actually. I was actually going to set it to false and then put the other one in there. But this works as well. So we're doing a little ternary. So we say Aria set attribute or input set attribute. We're going to set the Aria invalid data attribute, or not data attribute, the Aria attribute, and we're going to check the validity state of the input. And if it is valid, we're going to say Aria invalid is false. Otherwise, we're going to set it to true. Let's look at this now. Right now we have just the HTML that we wrote in our index.html file. When we tab out of that element, that's when our JavaScript runs. And then it checks this input and says, whoa, this is invalid. So we get Aria invalid. And it's actually being described by this errors input, which we've injected, called with an ID of name errors. And it's going to say that the value here is required. So that's pretty cool. If I submit the form, it takes for the second time I click the form to show that error. And that's the next thing I want to tackle is right now we have a little bit of an improved user experience that as a user tabs through, they get the errors as they go. Assistive technology users will not get the errors until they tab away, which is something that we can fix later on. But when a user finally gets down to submit the form and hits submit, an invalid form will go to the first invalid input and focus on it, which will tell assistive technology users that this value is required and blah, blah, blah. And they'll be able to see that because of the Aria described attribute. So that was a lot to cover. Let's see if there's any questions so far. Let's see. I could be replace children is useful here. Also will allow you to keep the space of the error message to not push the content down when one appears. Yeah, so you're basically saying, well, I'm not sure what you mean by replace children, but in order to keep the space so that we don't have that sort of jump, we'd basically have to have something there to begin with. So maybe we have this like an empty error container element, right? So this value is missing would just be like empty, and then you'd have some sort of styling on here so that it still has the height. I like that idea. The reason why I don't want to go for that is because, again, I like building things that are a little bit resilient and don't depend on the implementer to know how to do everything and finagle everything. Like if I just want to write a form that is accessible and works and everything, I'll do that just myself and probably have like this, what is it? Name errors in there. And then maybe I'll have that empty to begin with and have that as a placeholder. However, that's because I know that, once I have that there, I can also say that the Aria described by is going to be equal to that. And the issue that I run into is that a lot of the people that I've worked with, or a lot of people that I've talked to online, they don't necessarily study Aria attributes or know how to connect the things. So it's very nice when you can have a solution that kind of solves all of that for them. And in order to do that, I'm not sure that I would want to inject something into someone's DOM without their consent. Or that's to say that, like, it's very possible that this is the exact design that a developer wants or a designer wants, right? And if I inject something with my script, let's say that I'm a third-party library author for form validation, something, I don't want to preemptively create space for my text without, the consumer sort of knowing about it. And Injecting without consent is a common theme these days. Yes, it is. Sure is, but I don't want to do it. So what we can do is we can make a little bit of give and take and say that I'm not going to inject anything to begin with. It's going to look as expected. Presumably, it's kind of up to. It's weird that there's these like contracts between library authors and library consumers that we need to understand what is my responsibility and what's your responsibility. And I think it's your responsibility as a developer to tell a user more clearly which fields are required and which ones are not. I'm not going to do that as a library author, because if I, read that this is a required field, find the label and then mark it as required, that's kind of more hostile than of an approach. Whereas if I just tell users, hey, best practice is to mark things as required or something like that, that's up to the developer to implement. So part of my contract with developers is like, you have to make the things obvious of what's required to your users so that they fill it out. And at the point that a user fills it out with the happy path, they say, my name's Austin. My email is whatever, hey@blah.co. I want to put a number that's greater than 5, because as a developer, I know that the min value here is 5, but as a author or developer, I probably want to mention somewhere that the minimum value is 5 or whatever. I'm going to say my favorite operating system here is maybe Linux. If we follow the happy path, ideally my form or my JavaScript doesn't actually do anything. I mean, it takes over submitting the form and makes that API request behind the scenes. But as far as the developer's beautiful design, everything looks the same. Everything looks the same and works as expected. So I hope that kind of answers some of the questions and you glean some insight into what I think about when I create forms and JavaScript and interactions. Essentially, I kind of like to lean as heavily as I can on HTML. I think it's a beautiful language that lets us sort of be very declarative with what we want. But then at the same time, as a library author, I want the consumers of my library, myself included, to not really have to do anything. Like, there's no way for my library to know the names or labels or the types of inputs or what their validation is. But once I have a developer that can declaratively tell me what those things are, I can make some assumptions about the rest. Like, if the ID is missing, I can make some assumptions by generating a random ID. Or, the other assumptions, I guess here, the biggest assumption is that we want to show error messages after. Of course, I don't know. That's kind of a requirement. If we're going to remove the default HTML validation, that would probably be a feature of the library. So that should be pretty obvious to a library consumer before choosing to use my library. That's going to happen. So yeah, a little bit of give and take. And I basically like to do as little as possible when I actually implement my business logic. That's about all the time I have to write any code. So I'm going to stop there. Grant Glidewell. Shout out to Grant. Grant was asking about something that I had mentioned, that I can, let's see, I can instantiate a Git repository and push to GitHub without ever leaving VS Code. So let's actually look at what that looks like. I'm going to add a git ignore file. I'm going to put my node modules in there so that gets ignored. And Grant, baby, this one's for you. All of that should not be in there. So I think that might be an issue with VS Code. So let me pull that down. Maybe restart that. I think sometimes VS Code, it was tracking too many files in the source control stuff. That feature stopped working because of node modules. So now looking at our code, oh, you know what? It's because, oh, shoot. The reason why that was a problem was because I had actually already instantiated this as a Git repo, and I forgot to use my git ignore, which means I did submit my node modules in the previous build. So that's a problem. Right. Well, I guess we can do that as a different thing. Let's create a new file. Where am I going to save this? I'm going to save that, I guess, as plain text. New folder, example, open, save. Okay, so I've got my code here. It is an untitled one.txt file in this new project, and I'm going to show Grant Glidewell how to instantiate a Git repo and push to GitHub without ever leaving VS Code. So we go to the Git thing. Oh, shoot. I guess I got to open this folder, select my folder. Okay. Yes, I trust the authors of this folder. There's my project. There's my untitled file. Heyo. Okay, that's all saved. Now we go to our Git thing. We're going to initialize this Git repository. Oh, I can also directly publish this folder. Well, let's initialize the Git repository. Please. Code. You're making me look stupid. Huh. The extension GitHub wants to sign in. I'll do this another time. But that's basically the steps you would go through is you'd hit this initialize Git repository, and then in an existing project with a Git repository, you get this little thing down here. You can click that, push to master, create a new branch or whatever, and it all works seamlessly. And then before you know it, you go to GitHub and your project exists up there. So that's pretty cool. Again, that's it for today. I'll check the chat really quick for any last questions. Doesn't look like we have any. So yeah, thanks for coming along. I will be back on tomorrow at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if you want to join along for this or have questions, hit me up. If you have a cool project that you want me to take a look at, let me know. Maybe shoot it to me on Twitter in advance so that I can be prepared and have some more feedback. Twitter, hey, Austin Gill. That's my handle. Cool. Until then, have a good evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are, and I'll see you next time.